It was a gray October morning, and the Appalachian wilderness stretched for miles like a patchwork quilt of crimson, gold, and green. The forests, nestled deep in the mountains of West Virginia, were alive with the symphony of chirping birds and the soft rustle of leaves, the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. Mist clung low to the ground, and the air carried a sharp chill that signaled the coming of winter. It was a serene, almost sacred place, a world where nature ruled and humans were mere visitors. Near the edge of the forest, where the dense woods met a lonely stretch of winding road, lay a small clearing. It was here that a lioness prowled. She was not a native of this land. Far from it. Her name was Nala, an escapee from a defunct roadside zoo a few miles away. She had been illegally kept there for years, confined in a rusty cage that had stolen the sparkle from her golden eyes. But one fateful night, a thunderstorm had brought her freedom. A lightning strike had split an ancient oak tree, which crashed into her enclosure and broke the padlock that held her prisoner. For the first time in her life, Nala had tasted freedom, sprinting into the wild with the boundless energy of an animal finally released from its chains. Since then, she had made the mountains her home, moving silently through the thick underbrush, hunting deer and wild turkeys with the precision of a creature born to rule the wild. But life in these foreign woods wasn't easy. The Appalachian forests were not the plains of her ancestors. Food was scarcer, the terrain colder, and the humans in the area seemed more dangerous than she'd ever known. Yet, Nala adapted, surviving with the resilience that had always been her nature. Her tawny coat blended seamlessly with the autumn foliage, and her every movement was a study in grace and power. It was on this particular morning, as Nala patrolled her territory near the road, that her sharp ears caught a sound unlike any she had heard before. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the whisper of the wind and the chirping of birds. But as she tilted her head, the noise grew clearer, a soft, high-pitched wail, like the cry of a wounded fawn. Her ears twitched, and she froze, her muscles taut with focus. Her golden eyes scanned the clearing, narrowing as the cry came again, louder this time, more desperate. The sound was coming from the road. Cautiously, Nala approached, her enormous paws silent on the damp earth. As she crested a small rise and peered through the brush, she saw something that made her hesitate. Lying on the side of the narrow road, wrapped in nothing but a thin, blue blanket, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, its tiny fists flailing as it screamed into the empty wilderness. Its face was red with effort, and tears streaked its cheeks. For a moment, Nala stayed hidden, her instincts battling within her. This was not prey. It was not a threat. It was something else entirely. The lioness had seen humans before, the ones who had kept her captive, their harsh voices and cruel hands leaving her wary of their kind. But this human was different. It was small, helpless, and utterly alone. Her sharp nose caught the scent of milk and warmth, but also something else: fear. The baby's cries carried an undeniable sense of urgency, a call for help in a world too vast and dangerous for it to survive alone. And there was no one else. No mother, no father, no footsteps or voices in the distance. Just the baby and the lioness. Nala crept closer, her massive frame moving with the practiced stealth of a predator. She stopped just a few feet from the infant, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. The baby's cries faltered for a moment, its wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto the lioness. There was a heartbeat of silence, a fragile, suspended moment where predator and prey studied each other. But instead of fear, the baby let out a soft, hiccuping coo, its tiny hand reaching out toward the golden figure looming over it. The lioness blinked, her amber eyes softening. Something deep within her stirred, an instinct buried beneath years of captivity and survival. It was the same instinct that had driven her to protect her cubs back in the zoo, the same instinct that had once made her stay awake through the night to shield them from harm. The baby's vulnerability awakened something primal in her, something she could not ignore. Gently, almost hesitantly, Nala lowered her head, her rough tongue brushing against the infant's cheek in what could only be described as an act of comfort. The baby giggled softly, its cries subsiding as it nuzzled into the warmth of her fur. And just like that, the lioness made her decision. She would not leave this tiny creature to the mercy of the wild. Nala scooped the baby up carefully in her jaws, her teeth pressing lightly against the edges of the blanket to avoid hurting it. With the infant secure, she turned and padded back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. The road was empty once more, the only sign of what had transpired a faint indentation in the grass where the baby had lain. Miles away, in the small mountain town of Harper's Bend, a frantic search had begun. The child's mother, Emma, was beside herself with grief, her voice hoarse from calling out her baby's name. She had been driving home from the grocery store the night before when her car swerved to avoid a deer. The vehicle had skidded off the road, flipping into a ditch. Disoriented and injured, Emma had crawled free, only to find her baby missing. The infant's car seat had been flung from the wreckage, and despite hours of searching, no one had been able to find the child. Unbeknownst to her, her baby had not only survived but had been taken in by an unlikely guardian. In the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, a lioness cradled the child she had claimed as her own, unaware of the ripple effect her actions would soon unleash on both the wild and the human world. Deep within the dense Appalachian woods, Nala carried the baby to a small hollow she had claimed as her den. The forest was alive with the quiet hum of nature, the rustle of squirrels in the treetops, the soft whistle of the wind through the pines, and the distant babble of a stream. Nala placed the infant gently on a bed of dried leaves she had gathered. The child whimpered softly but did not cry, its tiny fingers curling around the folds of the blanket. Nala settled down beside the baby, her massive body forming a protective barrier against the cold. For the first time in years, the lioness felt something other than the gnawing hunger for survival. She felt purpose. But survival in the wild was no easy feat, and caring for a human child only added to the challenges. The baby's cries often echoed through the woods, a sound that could easily attract predators or hunters. Nala's instincts sharpened with each passing moment, her senses constantly on high alert. She hunted tirelessly, bringing back small prey to sustain herself, though she couldn't help but worry about the infant. Its soft whimpers tugged at a part of her she didn't fully understand, a maternal instinct that ran deeper than reason. As the days passed, Nala learned to read the baby's needs. When it cried out in hunger, she would nudge it gently, her eyes scanning the forest for anything that might sustain the tiny life. On one particularly frigid night, she came across a herd of deer and, after a swift chase, managed to bring one down. She returned to the den with a piece of the kill, her golden eyes reflecting the flicker of moonlight. Though the baby couldn't eat meat, the kill attracted scavengers, including a curious raccoon that had been rummaging near a hunter's camp. The lioness, surprisingly gentle for a creature of her size, allowed the raccoon to draw near and pilfer a small tin of formula powder left behind by the hunters. Nala didn't understand what it was, but the smell reminded her of the baby's faint scent. With delicate precision, she carried the tin back to the den and left it near the child. The baby sucked on the powdery mixture when Nala tipped it onto a leaf and, miraculously, quieted. Over time, the two began to form an unlikely bond. The child would reach out for the lioness, gripping her fur and cooing softly. Nala would stay close, her tail swishing gently as she watched the baby sleep. But as the bond between them grew, so too did the dangers. Meanwhile, in Harper's Bend, the search for the missing child intensified. Emma, the baby's mother, hadn't slept in days. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears. Flyers with a photograph of the infant were plastered across every lamppost, diner, and gas station in town. The local sheriff, Hank Mercer, had organized a search party to comb the surrounding woods, but hope was dwindling. "We're doing everything we can, Emma," Hank said one evening as he sat with her on the porch of her small home. "But it's been days. Out there. In this weather," he didn't finish the sentence, but Emma knew what he meant. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He's alive. I can feel it. A mother knows." Emma's words lingered in Hank's mind as he led another search party into the woods the following morning. The team fanned out, their voices echoing through the trees as they called the baby's name. They found remnants of the car crash, shards of glass, a torn piece of fabric, but no sign of the infant. However, one of the volunteers, an elderly tracker named Jim, noticed something unusual: paw prints. And not just any paw prints. These were massive, far larger than anything native to the region. "This ain't a black bear," Jim muttered, kneeling down to examine the tracks. His weathered face twisted with unease. "These are feline. Big feline." "Mountain lion?" one of the younger volunteers asked, his voice trembling slightly. Jim shook his head. "No mountain lion I've ever seen. Whatever this is, it's not supposed to be here." The news spread quickly, and soon rumors began to swirl through Harper's Bend. Some whispered about an escaped zoo animal, while others feared a dangerous predator stalking the woods. Hank dismissed the more outlandish theories, but he couldn't ignore the growing concern among the townsfolk. If there truly was a large predator in the area, it could pose a serious threat, not just to the search party, but to anyone venturing into the forest. Back in the woods, Nala was beginning to feel the pressure. She sensed the humans drawing closer, their strange smells and loud voices disrupting the peace of her territory. The baby, too, seemed restless, crying more frequently as if it could sense the tension in the air. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nala heard the sharp crack of a gunshot in the distance. Her ears flattened against her head, and she growled softly, her body instinctively moving to shield the infant. The lioness knew she couldn't stay in the den much longer. The humans were coming, and their presence threatened not only her life but the baby's as well. She needed to find a safer place, somewhere deeper in the forest where the search parties wouldn't venture. Carrying the baby carefully in her jaws, she began to navigate the dense underbrush, her movements swift and deliberate. She avoided the trails marked with human scent, choosing instead to travel along the hidden paths known only to the creatures of the wild. But even as Nala moved deeper into the woods, her mind lingered on the baby. She had done everything she could to protect it, to keep it safe. Yet, deep down, she knew that the child didn't belong in her world. The thought filled her with a strange sadness, a feeling she didn't fully understand. For all her strength and instincts, Nala couldn't provide what the baby truly needed: a mother, a family, a home. As the lioness pushed forward, the baby's soft cries echoed through the forest, a sound both haunting and beautiful. It was a cry that carried with it the weight of hope and despair, a fragile thread connecting two very different worlds. And though Nala didn't know it, that cry would soon lead the search party to her, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change all of their lives forever. The cold air of the Appalachian forest pressed in like a silent specter, wrapping the woods in an almost suffocating stillness. Nala, carrying the baby in her gentle grip, felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She moved with caution, her powerful body weaving between the towering pines and crunching over the brittle carpet of fallen leaves. The scent of humans lingered faintly in the air, growing stronger with each passing hour. She had been hunted before. She knew what it meant when the smell of humans came with the sharp tang of metal and fire. But this was different. She wasn't just fleeing for herself now. She was protecting something fragile, something she had claimed in the way only a mother could. The baby stirred weakly in the folds of its blanket, letting out a soft cry that pierced Nala's ears. The sound made her pause, her ears flicking back as her amber eyes scanned the shadows. She couldn't stay here much longer. The humans would come soon, and the baby's cries were like a beacon calling them closer. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in an eerie twilight. As darkness fell, the lioness found herself near the edge of a wide stream. The water, shimmering under the pale light of the moon, flowed briskly over jagged rocks. It wasn't deep, but the current was strong, and the chill of autumn had turned it into an icy ribbon slicing through the wilderness. Nala knew she would have to cross it to reach the deeper parts of the forest, where the trees grew thick enough to hide even her enormous form. She glanced down at the baby, who was fussing softly now, its tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as though seeking comfort. With a deep breath, Nala stepped into the stream. The icy water swirled around her legs, soaking her golden fur and sending a shiver through her body. She held her head high, the baby dangling carefully from her jaws as she waded forward. Halfway across, the current pushed harder, tugging at her paws and making the rocks beneath her feet feel slippery and unstable. For a moment, she hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But then the baby whimpered, its soft cry cutting through the sound of rushing water. Nala growled low in her throat and pressed on, her muscles tensing with each careful step. When she reached the other side, she climbed onto the muddy bank and shook herself off, droplets of water scattering into the air. The baby let out a startled coo at the sudden motion, but Nala quickly nuzzled it, her rough tongue brushing against its cheek in an attempt to soothe it. The child quieted almost instantly, and for a brief moment, the lioness allowed herself to relax. She had made it across. They were safe, at least for now. But safety was a fleeting illusion. Just as Nala began to move deeper into the forest, her sensitive ears picked up a sound that froze her in place. Voices. Human voices. They were distant but growing louder, echoing through the trees like an approaching storm. She turned her head, her sharp eyes catching the faint glow of flashlights cutting through the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she instinctively crouched low to the ground, her body curling protectively around the baby. "Over here," a voice called. I found more tracks. The humans were closer than she'd realized. Nala's mind raced, her instincts urging her to flee, but she couldn't leave the baby behind. She growled softly, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated in her chest. Her tail swished in agitation as the voices drew nearer, the beams of light flickering like ghostly figures between the trees. And then, through the chaos, she heard something that made her pause. Michael! Michael, can you hear me? It was a woman's voice, cracked and desperate. The name wasn't familiar to Nala, but the raw emotion in the voice was. It was the cry of a mother searching for her child, a sound that resonated deep within the lioness's being. She glanced down at the baby, who was now fully awake, its wide eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. It gurgled softly, as if responding to the voice. Nala felt an ache deep in her chest, a pull she couldn't explain. She had fought so hard to protect this tiny creature, to keep it safe from the dangers of the wild. But now, hearing the human's voice, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think before. The baby wasn't hers to keep. It belonged to the world of the humans, a world she didn't trust but knew was the baby's only chance at survival. The lioness stood, her powerful legs carrying her toward the sound of the voices. She moved cautiously, her ears flicking back and forth as she navigated the underbrush. The baby let out another small cry, and Nala paused, her heart thundering in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run deeper into the woods and disappear. But she didn't. Instead, she took another step, and then another, the voices growing louder with each passing moment. Finally, she reached the edge of a clearing. Through the trees, she could see the humans, a group of them, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like miniature suns. At the center of the group was a woman, her face pale and tear-streaked. She was clutching something in her hands, a small blanket, identical to the one wrapped around the baby. Nala hesitated, her massive frame hidden in the shadows. She lowered the baby gently onto the ground, nudging it with her nose as if urging it to cry out. And then she stepped back, retreating into the darkness but keeping her eyes fixed on the clearing. The baby stirred, its tiny fists flailing as it let out a wail that echoed through the trees. The woman froze, her head snapping toward the sound. "Michael!" she whispered, her voice trembling. She dropped the blanket and ran toward the noise, her flashlight shaking in her hands. When she reached the baby, she fell to her knees, her sobs breaking the stillness of the night. "My baby!" she cried, scooping the child into her arms. "Oh my God, Michael!" The rest of the search party rushed to her side, their voices a mixture of relief and disbelief. But none of them noticed the pair of golden eyes watching from the shadows. Nala lingered for a moment longer, her gaze locked on the woman cradling the baby. Then, with a final glance, she turned and disappeared into the forest, her massive paws silent on the leaf-strewn ground. Back in the clearing, Emma held her baby tightly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know how he had survived, how he had made it through the cold and the wild. But as she pressed her lips to his forehead, she felt a strange warmth, a sense of gratitude she couldn't quite explain. For though she didn't know it, her child had been protected by the most unlikely of guardians, a lioness who had answered the call of a mother's love. The night felt endless in its quiet majesty as Nala slipped back into the forest, her massive form melting into the shadows. The baby's cry had faded, replaced by the gentle murmur of human voices as the search party celebrated their miraculous discovery. From her hidden perch deep within the woods, the lioness paused and turned her head toward the sound. Her heart, though primal and instinctual, felt strangely heavy. Something about the baby's small warmth, the trust in its helpless eyes, had left an imprint on her soul. She stood still for a long moment, her ears twitching as she listened to the sounds of the humans retreating, their boots crunching against the underbrush. Eventually, the voices faded, swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness, and Nala was alone again. The stillness that had once been her refuge now felt hollow. With a soft growl, she began to move, her paws carrying her further into the forest, her mind conflicted in a way she couldn't understand. She was a creature of instinct, of survival, yet the days spent protecting the human child had stirred something deeper in her. Nala returned to her den, but the emptiness was palpable. The baby's scent lingered faintly in the bed of leaves where it had slept, a bittersweet reminder of what had been. The lioness lay down, her golden eyes wide and unblinking as she stared into the darkness. She had done what she could. The baby was safe now, back with its kind. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her, that the forest was no longer the same place it had been before. At the edge of the woods, Emma sat on the ground with her baby cradled in her arms, unwilling to let go even as the search party tried to guide her back toward the cars waiting at the trailhead. The relief coursing through her was overwhelming, yet her mind was awash with questions. How had Michael survived out here, alone, for so many days? She ran her fingers over his tiny face, taking in every detail as though she couldn't believe he was real. The search party marveled at the situation, their voices low and filled with awe. "I don't get it," one of them said, shaking his head. "A baby can't survive in these woods on its own. Something had to be protecting him." Jim, the old tracker, had been quiet throughout the commotion, but now he stepped forward, his weathered face etched with thought. "I saw the tracks," he said. "Big cat. Real big. Bigger than anything we've got around here." He glanced at the baby, his eyes narrowing. Whatever it was, it didn't hurt him. "That's what gets me." Emma looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Are you saying—" She stopped, her voice catching. The thought was too strange, too unbelievable to put into words. Jim shrugged, his gaze drifting toward the dark line of trees in the distance. "All I know is, that baby didn't make it out of this alive on his own. Something was looking out for him." Emma tightened her grip on Michael, her mind racing. She thought of the deep scratches she'd seen on the baby's blanket, the faint musky scent that clung to him, unlike anything she'd smelled before. And then there was the strange warmth she'd felt when she found him, as though he'd been sheltered against the biting cold. None of it made sense, but deep in her heart, she felt a quiet gratitude for whatever force had watched over her son. The days passed, and life in Harper's Bend began to return to normal. The story of Michael's rescue spread quickly, capturing the imagination of the small town and beyond. The local news picked up the tale, dubbing it the miracle in the mountains. People speculated endlessly about how the baby had survived, each theory wilder than the last. Some claimed he'd been cared for by a pack of wolves. Others believed a kind-hearted hermit living deep in the woods had found him and left him for the search party to discover. Emma didn't participate in the speculation. She didn't care what people thought or how they tried to explain it. All that mattered to her was that her son was alive. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Michael slept peacefully in his crib, she couldn't stop herself from wondering. Her mind often returned to the tracks the search party had found, to the stories of an escaped lioness from a roadside zoo a few years back. The idea seemed impossible, like something out of a fairy tale. And yet, every time she thought of the warmth she'd felt when she held her son that night in the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the truth was stranger than anything she could imagine. For Nala, life in the forest carried on, though it wasn't the same. She roamed the familiar trails, hunted the same prey, and drank from the same streams, but the days felt emptier, quieter. Her encounter with the baby had changed her in ways she didn't fully understand. She no longer prowled the edges of the woods near the human world, avoiding their presence entirely. It wasn't fear that kept her away, but something else, a kind of knowing. She had stepped into their world for a brief moment, and though she had returned to her own, part of her remained tied to the child she had saved. As autumn gave way to winter, Nala's golden coat thickened against the cold, and the forest settled into a deep stillness. One evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, she found herself wandering near the stream she had crossed with the baby in her jaws. The memory of that night came rushing back to her, vivid and raw. She paused by the water's edge, her reflection rippling in the icy current, and let out a low, rumbling sound that echoed softly through the trees. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something gentler, a sound that carried with it the weight of loss and gratitude. Miles away, in the warmth of her home, Emma rocked Michael in her arms, humming softly as he drifted off to sleep. The baby's tiny hand curled around her finger, and she smiled, her heart full. Yet, as she sat there, a strange feeling washed over her, like the brush of an unseen presence. She glanced toward the window, where the snow was falling steadily, and for a moment, she thought she saw a pair of golden eyes watching her from the shadows. But when she blinked, the vision was gone, leaving only the quiet of the night. In the wilderness, the lioness turned and padded away, her massive paws leaving faint impressions in the snow. She didn't look back, but in her heart, she carried the memory of the child she had saved. And though they would never cross paths again, their lives had been intertwined in a way that neither could ever forget. In the silence of the forest, under the light of the moon, Nala walked on, her spirit unbroken and her heart forever marked by the fragile, beautiful bond she had shared with a human child. The snow had blanketed the Appalachian wilderness in a soft, unbroken sheet of white, muffling the world in a serene silence. Somewhere deep in those woods, Nala moved gracefully through the trees, her tawny coat blending with the pale light of dawn. She paused at a ridge, her eyes scanning the horizon where the human world began, just beyond the edge of the forest. It was a world she would never fully understand, a world that had hurt her, caged her, and then inadvertently shown her something she never expected to feel: connection. For the lioness, life would go on. She would survive as she always had, relying on instinct and resilience. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the trees and the moon cast its silver glow over the land, she would remember the infant she had cradled in her jaws, the soft warmth of its fragile body. It had been a fleeting bond, an impossible one, yet it had changed her irrevocably. In the human child, she had found a purpose beyond herself, if only for a short while. In the small town of Harper's Bend, Emma clung to her son every day with a gratefulness that couldn't be put into words. She no longer needed to explain how her baby had survived or why. It was enough to know that he had been saved. The rumors and wild stories that had gripped the town faded with time, replaced by the quiet rhythm of life returning to normal. But for Emma, the forest would always hold a kind of sacred mystery, a place where her son's life had been cradled by something beyond comprehension. One day, as the first buds of spring began to bloom, Emma took Michael for a walk near the edge of the woods. He was older now, his tiny legs kicking excitedly in her arms as she carried him. She stopped by the stream where he had been found, the memory of that night washing over her with a quiet intensity. She crouched down and held him close, her voice a soft whisper. "You're here because someone or something cared enough to keep you safe," she said, her words more for herself than for him. "I don't know what it was, but I'll thank it every day of my life." The baby gurgled happily, his tiny hand reaching toward the tree-lean as if he, too, felt the pull of something unseen. Emma smiled and stood, turning back toward the town, but not before casting one last glance at the woods. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw movement, the faint outline of a figure, large and golden, blending perfectly with the trees. But when she looked again, it was gone. In the years to come, the story of the baby and the lioness would fade into a quiet legend told in whispers among the townsfolk. It became a story of the impossible, a tale of survival, of nature's capacity for compassion in even its wildest form. And though Emma never saw the lioness again, she felt her presence every time she walked near the woods. She would look out at the trees and wonder if the creature still roamed, watching over the world with the same fierce protection she had shown Michael. In her heart, she knew the answer. As for Nala, she lived on, her story written not in words but in the footsteps she left behind, in the silent connection she had forged with a human child. And though she would never again feel the warmth of his tiny body pressed against her fur, she carried him with her, a memory etched into her soul like the call of the wind through the trees. Some bonds, no matter how brief, transcend understanding. They are timeless, unspoken, and eternal. And in the stillness of the Appalachian wilderness, where the forest stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a lioness and a child remained forever connected by the quiet miracle of love.